In the silence of the ruins, when the wind weaves through the empty arcades of an ancient amphitheater, when rain slides over the cracked marble of a forgotten statue, or pools in the grooves of a triumphal arch covered in moss, something deep continues to speak, not with words, not with cries, but with the eternal language of stone. The art and architecture of Rome, so vast, so present even today, were not merely aesthetic expressions. Above all, they were a calculated discourse, an instrument of domination, a mirror of power that wished to be eternal. And contrary to what inattentive eyes might think, Rome's monuments were not created for the mere delight of the senses. They were conceived as symbolic weapons, as tools of control, as sculpted texts meant to be read by the illiterate crowds that filled the streets of the eternal city. Since the earliest times, Rome understood that beauty could be used as a mask of power, that a column is not just a stone structure, but a promise of order, that a mosaic is more than a colorful composition. It is the expression of a collective identity, of an ideology imposed upon all eyes. In every carved marble, there was a political gesture. In every temple erected, an attempt to capture eternity. In every square designed with obsessive symmetry, the expression of a hierarchical, rational, and centralized world. Rome did not simply build, it choreographed the urban space as a stage on which every citizen, every soldier, every visitor was also a spectator of its grandeur. It is impossible to walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum or the galleries of a villa in Pompeii without feeling the weight of this hidden intent. The visual arts and architecture were the visual language of domination. Unlike the Greek model, centered on the contemplation of idealized beauty, the Roman model was pragmatic, functional, propagandistic. It had to persuade, it had to dazzle, it had to terrify, all at once. Just as an emperor would enter the Senate draped in purple, flanked by statues of gods and ancestors, Rome's buildings served to declare, here lies the center of the world, here dwells power, and everything you see is a reflection of the will of the gods and of Caesar. It is into this symbolic universe that we will now immerse ourselves, not merely to admire columns, frescoes, or domes, but to decipher the visual code of an empire that used art as a shield, as a weapon, as a bridge between mortals and the eternal, an empire that carved its ideology into marble, painted its order on the walls of noble houses, and raised its greatness with bricks, cement, bronze, and ambition. In this hypnotic documentary, with the sound of rain in the background, we will hear the voice of the stone, because in Rome, even silence was carved. Before Rome raised its imposing columns, its monumental forums, and its triumphal arches, other hands were already sculpting beauty and power on the Italian peninsula. And to understand how Rome created its unmistakable aesthetic, we must first go back in time, to the civilizations that shaped the Roman gaze. The empire, which would later become known for its architectural grandeur and sculptural expressiveness, was, in its beginnings, an attentive disciple. In its artistic DNA, we find two direct ancestors, the Etruscans and the Greeks. One transmitted a somber religiosity and funerary rites. The other, the perfection of form, the symmetry of the body, harmony as a universal language. The Etruscans, mysterious inhabitants of central northern Italy, left a deep and often underestimated legacy. They were the first to bury their dead in true cities of the dead, necropolises with decorated chambers, funerary statues and sarcophagi depicting the deceased reclining as if celebrating eternity. From them, the Romans learned that art could preserve memory and give shape to the sacred. Etruscan architecture, with its wooden and earthen temples, stone foundations, and terracotta rooftop sculptures, directly influenced the first Roman temples. Even the rituals of founding cities, the interpretation of omens, and the symbolic relationship with space all came from the Etruscan tradition. Rome did not begin with marble. It began with clay and spirit. Greece, with its refined aesthetics and idealized pantheon of gods, was a school of beauty, proportion, and myth for Rome. When the Romans conquered Hellenic cities, they did not destroy their art. On the contrary, they absorbed it voraciously. Greek statues were taken as trophies to decorate Roman squares, houses, and temples. Greek artists were commissioned to work on public and private projects. Marble copies of original Greek sculptures became a common sight. But the Romans were not content to merely imitate. They adapted. Greek sculpture idealized the human body as divine. The Roman preferred the realistic portrait, marked by time, by the wrinkles of experience, by the signs of authority. While the Greeks sought the ideal of beauty, the Romans sought the powerful likeness. In architecture, the Greek legacy merged with Roman practical audacity. The classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, were preserved and reorganized on the facades of public buildings. But what the Greeks built with balance, the Romans expanded with ambition. They invented concrete, mastered the arch, and created the dome. What was once symmetry became monumentality. The Greek temple rested on steps. The Roman temple projected forward like a stage. Art and architecture ceased to be contemplative and became performative. They were messages in stone. This fusion between Etruscan mysticism and Greek idealism gave rise to a profoundly Roman aesthetic. Hierarchical, symbolic, functional, and grand. An art that was not merely a cultural reflection, but a political project. When Caesar walked down the Via Sacra flanked by statues of Greek heroes and Etruscan gods, he was not simply walking among works of art. He was moving among symbols of power, legitimacy, and eternity. And in doing so, he transformed the past of others into symbolic capital for the empire he himself personified. Rome was born looking at others, but it knew how to turn admiration into appropriation. And it was this ability to absorb, transform, and impose that made it unique. The beauty of Rome was not innocent. It was calculated. And before it was Roman, it was Greek. It was Etruscan. It was a mirror that reflected others in order to glorify itself. Thus was born the imperial aesthetic, a mosaic of influences shaped by the will to last forever. In a culture where name and blood carried an almost mythical weight, the face became an absolute symbol. For the Romans, a portrait was not merely a representation of the individual, it was a political tool, a symbolic weapon, a portable monument to virtue and ancestry. In each bust sculpted in marble, in each feature carved with almost photographic precision, Rome conveyed a powerful message. Here stands a man worthy of remembrance, fear, or veneration. Unlike Greek art, which idealized bodies and faces with divine perfection, Roman art sought the truth of time. Wrinkles, scars, weary eyes, and tense jaws were not imperfections. They were trophies, marks of a life of service, glory, and dominion. Roman realism, especially during the Republican period, expressed a deeply moral and civic ideology. The eldest patricians made a point of being portrayed with severe aged features marked by responsibility and discipline. It was the face of virtus, of gravitas, of the austerity that guided the Senate and the destiny of the city. Busts were not luxurious decorations. They were instruments of public persuasion. They stood in the atriums of homes, in temples dedicated to ancestors, in public squares. They were displayed at funerals and processions to prove that the citizen came from a noble lineage marked by public deeds. In Republican Rome, the portrait was the visual document of merit. With the rise of the empire, this tradition was maintained, but it took on a new dimension: imperial propaganda. The face of the emperor was not merely a personal symbol, it was the portrait of the state itself. With each new ruler, coins were minted, statues were erected, temples were adorned with his image. Augustus, for example, chose to be portrayed as young, serene, and nearly divine, even in old age. His carefully curated image contrasted with that of the earlier republic and established a new paradigm: eternal, idealized, omnipresent power. The portrait then became a visual instrument of unification for the empire. In every province, from Egypt to Hispania, any citizen could look at a coin and recognize the ruler. The emperor's face was an extension of Rome's power, but it was not only powerful men who sought eternity in marble. Elite women, though fewer in number in public art, also used portraiture as a mark of status and influence. Often depicted as goddesses, with elaborate hairstyles that served as visual codes of the era and the imperial household. They too participated in this symbolic game. The statue of Livia, wife of Augustus for instance, blends matronly sobriety with divine idealization, representing the fusion of traditional morality with the new cult of dynasty. Over time, realism gave way to more stylized forms, especially during the crises of the 3rd century after Christ, when art began to reflect the instability of the empire. The eyes of statues became more abstract, the features less individualized, as if the face were dissolving amid the collapse. The portrait shifted from an instrument of glory to a reflection of decline. Even so, the tradition survives. When walking through the museums of Europe, or among the ruins of Rome and encountering a bust of Cicero, of Trajan, or of Seneca, it feels as though time stands still. There is a gaze directed at us, crossing the centuries with a silent question. Do you still recognize the power of my name? More than any other, Roman portraiture taught humanity that a face can endure longer than a dynasty, speak more eloquently than a speech, and be more immortal than an empire. Among the ruins of Rome, silent figures still rise, unmoved by time, yet alive in the imagination of an entire civilization. Statues, colossi, monuments, and pedestals were the messengers of a carefully constructed narrative, that of power as physical presence, as eternity carved in stone. No city of antiquity was as filled with stone bodies as Rome. None was so obsessed with using the human figure as a mirror of authority. For the Romans, sculpting was more than art. It was a way to eternalize glory, to fix the past, and to shape the future through the idealized image of the present. Statues were placed in every visible space, in squares, temples, forums, public baths, and the gardens of villas. There was a true politics of image. To be remembered, one had to be seen, and to be seen, one had to be sculpted. Bronze and marble became the symbolic bodies of emperors, generals, senators, and even gods domesticated by the state. It was not just about depicting the individual, but about projecting onto them public virtues, pietas, virtus, clementia, justitia. Just as a monument marked a military victory, a statue marked a moral triumph. During the Republic, commemorative statues were erected based on public merit. Citizens who had saved lives, won battles, or rendered great service to the city could be honored with a statue in the forum. But with the empire, that logic transformed. Merit gave way to the cult of authority. Statues of Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian multiplied throughout the cities as symbols of an empire that wished to be visible in every stone. The deified bodies of emperors were no longer mere portraits. They were epiphanies. In some statues, the ruler is portrayed as Apollo, Jupiter, or Mars, fusing his image with that of the traditional pantheon. It was political apotheosis, where man merged with the divine through aesthetics. The choice of materials was no accident. White marble, associated with purity and grandeur, often came from the quarries of Mount Pentelicus or Carrara. Bronze, more expensive and harder to preserve, was used for equestrian statues and high-impact portraits. Few specimens survived the fury of the centuries and the recycling of metal, but the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, still reigning in the Capitoline Square, is one such miracle. Mounted on horseback, arm raised, he commands not only the animal, but also the space, the city, and posterity. There stands the perfect image of the philosopher-emperor, serene and absolute. Narrative monuments, such as Trajan's column or the reliefs on triumphal arches, went beyond static form. They told stories. They were books in stone for a largely illiterate people. Battles, marches, defeated enemies, and gods favoring Rome were all carved into them. Roman monumental art was both memory and doctrine, a civic lesson carved to last millennia. In times of crisis, many of these monuments were re-sculpted. Faces were erased, names scraped off, enemies eliminated from the narrative. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation to oblivion, was applied not only in books, but also on statues. Marble thus became a symbolic battlefield, where time was manipulated according to the current power. Eternity was editable, and yet, even damaged, mutilated, covered in lichen, or forgotten in archaeological storage rooms, these works still speak. The gaze of a Roman statue, even without pupils, still communicates. The posture, the gesture, the presence, all reveal an empire that sought to become immortal through image. And in a way, it succeeded. For in every corner of the world where a Roman statue now rests, the will to power that raised it still echoes, a deep, unbreakable desire to remain forever in stone. In every Roman arch there is more than stone and geometry. There is a petrified cry of victory, a silent celebration of conquest, a page of history carved to withstand time and the memory of the vanquished. The monumental arches, perhaps one of the most symbolic forms of Roman architectural art, were not mere passageways. They were narrative portals, colossi of propaganda erected to eternalize military achievements, glorify emperors, and construct a visual public memory that fused architecture, sculpture, and ideology into a single body. Each arch marked a symbolic threshold between past and future, between war and peace, between man and myth. Unlike temples which connected the living to the gods, or forums which organized civic life, triumphal arches celebrated the epic moment of victory. They were born from a precise event, a military triumph, a frontier expansion, the domination of a foreign people, and materialized that moment in a grand and visible form. Erected in strategic locations of the cities, especially along entryways, in public squares or near the Roman Forum, they served as permanent markers of glory. As a citizen passed beneath an arch, they were invited to relive that triumph, as if time folded in on itself and the victory happened again, eternally. One of the most famous is the Arch of Titus, erected in 71 after Christ to commemorate the conquest of Jerusalem. On its lateral reliefs, we see Roman soldiers carrying the sacred menorah from the Jewish temple, while chained prisoners follow behind. The details of the tunics, the tensed muscles, the expressive faces, all were sculpted to impact, to stir emotion, to assert Rome's supremacy, not only over Palestine, but over any people who dared resist its power. The arch was thus a form of three-dimensional political narrative, expanded sculpture, a message etched into the city itself. Another emblematic example is the Arch of Constantine, the largest and most imposing of all, built in 315 after Christ. Celebrating Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, this arch is an ideological collage of styles, incorporating reused reliefs from earlier monuments such as those of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. The intention was clear: to link the new emperor to the glory of the great leaders of the past. By recycling imperial art, Constantine shaped his own legacy as the legitimate heir of eternal Rome. And by erecting this arch near the Colosseum, he reinforced the fusion of power, spectacle, and history. Architecture became here a visual discourse of continuity and legitimacy. Not only emperors, but also renowned generals could be honored with arches. Some more modest arches were built in distant provinces, such as in Orange in Gaul or in Timgad in North Africa. Even outside the capital, these monuments functioned as replicas of Roman ideology, spreading its aesthetics and values throughout the empire. To see an arch was to see Rome, no matter where one stood. Marble communicated order, victory, the presence of the state. The arches also had practical and ceremonial functions. Often they were starting points for processions, markers for military parades or religious celebrations. In rituals celebrating the return of the armies, generals passed beneath the arches as they entered the city, as if purified by the very symbol of victory. There was, therefore, a theatricality embedded in the architecture. Each arch was a fixed stage for a performance repeated across time and memory. Over the centuries, many of these arches were looted, dismantled, or reduced to ruins, and yet those that remain still speak. They are silent witnesses of a world that saw in stone the most solid way to tell its story. Through them, Rome turned battles into myths, commanders into demigods, walls into monuments. Each arch is a doorway to the past, but also a window into Rome's most intimate desire, not merely to win, but to be remembered, celebrated, and above all, immortalized in art. Rome did not merely project itself into space, it shaped space in its own image. Every stone laid, every street traced, every building erected was a political declaration, an imposition of order, a staging of dominance. Roman architecture was not limited to providing shelter or functionality. Above all, it was a language, and that language declared, here rules civilization, here is the center of the world. Nowhere was this intention more clearly manifested than in the monumental architecture of Gazi power. The forums, the basilicas, and the palaces, structures that not only organized urban space, but also shaped the vision the common citizen was to have of the state itself. The forums were far more than public squares. They were the symbolic and administrative hearts of Rome and of every city that replicated its model. From the republican origins of the Roman Forum to the imperial forums of Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan. These spaces concentrated temples, statues, commemorative columns, courts, markets, and speakers' platforms. It was in the forum that people spoke, negotiated, judged, and worshipped. It was there that all eyes turned toward the images of ancestors, the sculpted emperors, and the protective gods of the state. Each forum was a microcosm of the empire, an urban theater where power became visible, tangible, monumental. As one passed through it, the citizen was enveloped in a spectacle of symmetry, grandeur, and vigilance. Within these forums, the basilicas rose as multifunctional, adaptable, and emblematic buildings. With long naves, majestic colonnades, and soaring vaults, they initially served as venues for commercial transactions, legal trials, and civic gatherings. But over time, they also became symbols of moral and legal authority. The Basilica Aemilia, the Basilica Julia, and later the Basilica Ulpia in Trajan's Forum illustrate this evolution. It is no coincidence that the basilica model would later be adopted by Christians for the construction of their churches. It was the architectural form of order, authority, and collective discourse. Roman legal architecture, with its symmetry and solemnity, made law a nearly divine presence. The palaces, as the name itself suggests, derived from the Palatine Hill where the emperors resided, were not mere residences. They were embodiments of absolute power. The imperial palace was not a home, but an institution. The Domus Aurea, built by Nero after the fire of Rome, is an extreme example of this theatricalization of power. With its rotating banquet halls, artificial lakes, luxurious frescoes, and superhuman proportions, the imperial residence transformed the emperor into a figure that straddled the human and the divine. The world around him turned to serve him, and more than comfort, what truly mattered was the visual impact, the symbolic intimidation, the aesthetic experience of submission. The strategic placement of these buildings also revealed their ideological function. Forums near the Capitoline or the Colosseum, palaces atop the Palatine, from where the emperor could literally look down upon the city. Basilicas aligned along the central axis of the urban grid. Everything followed a visual and ceremonial logic. Architecture guided the citizens' gaze and movement, leading them along a path of reverence and discipline. Rome was a city designed as a stage. In it, everyone had a role to play, and the scenography was made of stone, bronze, and marble. Over time, as the empire expanded, replicas of these structures were built across the provinces. In Merida, in Ephesus, in Carthage, in Palmyra, forums and basilicas emerged, visually connecting all territories to the central image of Rome. It was aesthetics as an instrument of Romanization, urban planning as a tool of integration, and even after the political collapse of the empire, the forms endured. Monasteries were built atop basilicas, palaces became fortresses, and forums turned into medieval squares. But the structure, both symbolic and architectural, remained. For Rome, the art of building was the art of ruling. On stone, the Romans engraved the map of domination, and every building of power was not merely a work of engineering. It was a visual choreography where the population learned day after day who ruled, why, and with what glory. The city spoke, and it spoke loudly, and its language was made of columns, porticos, domes, and corridors, where silence echoed louder than any speech. In Rome, even war was beautiful, not in the peaceful sense of harmony, but in the brutal choreography of conquest turned into art. War, which in other cultures was treated with fear or as a mere practical necessity, was in Rome elevated to a civic, moral, and aesthetic ideal. Battles, sieges, marches, and massacres were not hidden. They were celebrated, sculpted, eternalized. Rather than conceal blood, Rome turned it into stone. And from its commemorative columns, narrative friezes, and triumphal reliefs, it created an epic gallery of justified violence, exalted domination, and carved glory. Each block, each image, each sequence of marching soldiers or falling barbarians carried a message. Rome wins, and this shall be remembered forever. Among all expressions of this warlike aesthetic, the Column of Trajan's, erected in 113 after Christ, is the most eloquent example. Standing 38 meters tall with over 200 meters of spiraling narrative, the column tells, in continuous imagery, the Emperor Trajan's campaigns against the Dacians. Instead of relying on texts or speeches, the architects and sculptors of the time chose a visual language accessible to all. Hundreds of figures arranged in sequential scenes depict bridges being built, cities under siege, enemies surrendering, offerings made to the gods, and at the center of it all, always, the calm and strategic figure of Trajan, appearing repeatedly as the absolute protagonist of order and justice. It is a story in stone, not just a victory, but a lesson. The Sati column of Marcus Aurelius, built decades later, repeats the formula with a darker tone. Its images of the Marcomannic Wars are harsher, showing the suffering of enemies, acts of punishment, and the emperor's fury. It reflects the transformation of the empire itself. If Trajan carved confidence, Marcus Aurelius carved tension. Still, both speak with the same imperial accent. War is a Roman virtue. And stone, its faithful scribe, the sole friezes of triumphal arches, and the reliefs on monuments and sarcophagi follow this same visual logic. On the Arch of Constantine Wailand, for instance, battle scenes, public speeches, and moments of imperial clemency blend into a visual narrative that connects the ruler to Rome's glorious past and consolidated present. War there is not merely conquest, it is the purification of the world. Through war, Rome brings order to chaos, subdues barbarians, and imposes its vision of civilization. Even in smaller objects, such as vases, coins, or funerary stelae, this military iconography appears. The image of the ideal Roman soldier, with detailed armor, round shield, and upright spear, became a recurring symbol, almost a trademark of Roman power. Just as the emperor's body was portrayed as a model of virtue, the body of the legionary was the model of the perfect citizen soldier. The aesthetic of war was not only grand, it was normative. It is important to remember that, for the Romans, war was not a necessary evil, but a pillar of collective identity. Art made that belief visible. Even when it depicted pain, mourning, or destruction, it did so through the lens of Roman moral superiority. The defeated were portrayed with intense expressions, exotic garments, gestures of supplication, not merely as enemies, but as characters destined for subjugation. War was therefore theatricalized to reinforce the narrative of imperial destiny. The Roman aesthetic of violence educated, justified, and fascinated. With the arrival of Christianity and the empire's cultural transformation, these images began to fade. War was no longer celebrated on columns, but reinterpreted as sin and penance in basilica mosaics. Yet the ancient stones remained. And even today, when one looks at the column of Trajan or the reliefs of the Arch of Titus, one does not see only the masterful technique of sculpture. One sees an ideology that understood war as a language. A Rome that not only fought, but turned its struggle into an eternal and irresistibly beautiful spectacle. Among the many arenas of Roman power, few were as effective and as seductive as the theater. More than a stage for actors and playwrights, the Roman theater was an instrument of social cohesion, a vehicle for cultural propaganda, and above all, a public performance of imperial order. It was not merely a space for laughter or tragedy, it was the carefully constructed reflection of Rome itself. In every semicircular tier of seating, in every decorative column, in every monumental entrance, there was a political project behind the entertainment. Theater was not just spectacle, it was pedagogy, and Rome's scenic architecture was designed to teach, entertain, and control. Inspired by the Greek model but adapted to Roman scale and pragmatism, the theater took on a distinct and powerful form. The Romans eliminated the need for natural slopes and began to build independent structures, elevated with arches, concrete, and precise engineering, which allowed this art form to expand to every city in the empire. The cavea, the audience area, was divided by social classes, with seats assigned to senators, equestrians, plebeians, and sometimes women and foreigners. The very arrangement of the audience thus visually reinforced the social hierarchy. To sit in the theater was to accept the place the state had given you. The Arsenai fronds, the richly decorated stage backdrop with columns, niches, and statues, represented the idealized world of Rome. Behind it lay the backstage of imperial cultural politics. The plays performed, often adaptations of Greek texts, were updated with political relevance. In the comedies of Plautus and Terence, for example, audiences saw depictions of social vices, but also the Roman virtues of obedience, duty, and authority. Even satire, so popular among the people, was carefully monitored. Nothing was presented by accident. Laughter was permitted, but never deep questioning of imperial order. More than words, the architecture of the theatre spoke loudly. Grand theatres such as the Theatre of Marcellus in Rome, or those in Orange Marcia Spendos and Ephesus in the provinces, were visual victories. They demonstrated Rome's technical capability, the presence of the state, and the generosity of the emperors who funded them. It was common for theatrical buildings to be gifted by rulers to cities, and their inscriptions reminded all who paid for that collective pleasure. In this sense, the theatre was a temple of imperial benevolence. Equally significant was the role of the amphitheatre, a typically Roman invention that merged the structure of the theatre with the circular form of combat arenas. The Colosseum, the ultimate symbol of this architecture, went far beyond entertainment. It was the performance of absolute domination. Gladiators, wild beasts, public executions, and simulated battles served to reaffirm, before an audience of up to 50,000 people, that Rome was invincible, that justice was swift, and that the empire was at peace, because violence was staged to keep it off the real streets. These spaces also functioned as social pressure valves. By offering free entry, food, and games, rulers secured popular support and diverted political tensions into the arena of spectacle. The famous panem panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not merely a criticism, it was a sophisticated strategy of social pacification. By feeding the body and captivating the senses, Rome also fed obedience. And by turning politics into spectacle, it dissolved critique into applause. Even religious festivals, such as the Saturnalia, or the scenic festivals linked to the gods, like the Megalensian Games, reinforced this union of faith, spectacle, and state. On the stage, gods were performed, but in the audience it was the emperor who reigned. Roman theatre, therefore, was a mirror. It reflected the city's glory, the strength of government, and the superiority of Roman culture over all other peoples. And in the reflection of this carefully staged performance, each citizen learned, with or without words, to love and fear Rome. If in the streets of Rome art spoke loudly to the people, inside the homes it murmured with sophistication and with equally political intentions. The domus is of patricians, the mansions of provincial elites, and even some residences of wealthy merchants gradually became true private galleries, where aesthetic taste blended with ostentation, erudition, and power. The Roman home was not just an intimate refuge, it was a public stage. It was there, on the decorated walls and meticulously adorned floors, that the master of the house affirmed his identity, his status, and his allegiance to the values of imperial culture. Every fresco, every sculpture, every mosaic, framed by internal colonnades, was a carefully calculated visual phrase: I am Rome. I belong to the civilizing elite. Crossing the atrium soirs of a Roman house, the visitor was immediately impacted by a symbolic mise-en-scène. Fountains, ancestral busts, painted columns, and mythological figures shaped the atmosphere. Frescoes, a technique inherited from the Greeks, were applied to walls with themes ranging from daily life scenes and heroic myths to idyllic landscapes and illusionistic architectural representations. In the houses of Mont Pompeius and Herculaneum, tragically frozen by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 after Christ, we find intact examples of this domestic aesthetic. There we see Aphrodite emerging from the sea, Dionysus in drunken revelry, or bucolic scenes that projected an ideal world within the home. But none of it was random. Choosing to depict a myth or a landscape was an aesthetic decision, but also a moral, political, and cultural one. The triclinium, the banquet hall, was one of the main stages of domestic art. It was there that the host welcomed guests, and it was also there that the mosaics on the floor and the paintings on the walls fulfilled their pedagogical function. Mosaics featuring hunting scenes, mythical battles, or philosophical allegories composed a visual repertoire meant to impress the visitor. A simple image of Ulysses resisting the sirens could be read as a sign of rationality and self-control. A panel of Hercules fighting monsters suggested strength and virtue. Even the gods placed around fountains became part of the symbolic furniture of power. Mosaics, in particular, became a hallmark of Roman domestic art, composed of thousands of tiny colored stones, the tesserae. They covered the floors with complex and highly detailed scenes. The technique, which required patience and precision, was both decorative and symbolic. In wealthier homes, mosaics could extend from the atrium to the private baths, narrating stories, exalting virtues, or simply displaying the refined taste of the owner. In many cases, the most famous mosaic in the house was the one placed at the entrance with inscriptions like Sage, Cave Canem, Beware of the Dog, or humorous depictions of slaves, vendors, and animals, blending real life with the theatrical spirit of Rome. Domestic art also reflected the cosmopolitan complexity of the empire. Egyptian, Greek, Syrian, and African elements were incorporated into the Roman visual repertoire, revealing a taste for exoticism and cultural dominance. Having a statue of Isis or a mosaic with nilotic motifs was not just a fashion, it was proof of familiarity with the conquered territories, a way of saying that Rome was the world, and the world Rome. This aesthetic appropriation was both a celebration of diversity and a silent assertion of the imperial capital's centrality. As centuries passed and the great patrician fortunes declined, domestic art became simpler, more symbolic, and less exuberant. But even in more modest homes, the aesthetic impulse endured. Mural paintings with Pompeian red backgrounds, simple geometric mosaics, small statues of Lares and Penates, the household gods, revealed that beauty was part of the cultural identity of the ordinary Roman. Art was not the exclusive privilege of the elite. It was embedded in daily urban life, in the rhythm of family routines, in the ritual of meals, in post-bath contemplation, in conversations within the peristyle. And even today, when we visit the preserved houses of Pompeii, or the museums that guard these fragments of aesthetic life, we can still feel the pulse of a civilization that made art both an intimate and public language. The Roman house was a miniature Rome, a place where marble met myth, where beauty was shaped with intent, and where the silence of images spoke louder than any discourse. The home was the temple of identity, and the mosaic, its most enduring scripture. In Rome, the gods did not dwell only in the heavens, they were in the stones, in the walls, on the rooftops, on the columns. They were molded, sculpted, painted, and staged with symbolic precision to remind, at every corner, in every square, in every temple, that the empire was upheld not only by the strength of its armies or the cunning of its politics, but by divine favor. Roman religious art was more than an expression of faith. It was a tool of power, a mechanism of legitimization, an instrument to fuse the earthly with the sacred, the human with the immortal. In every votive relief, in every cult statue, in every tympanum adorned with myths, Rome affirmed that its greatness was not a human construction, but a design of the gods, and that the emperor was the link between the two worlds. The vast and flexible Roman pantheon allowed for an immense iconographic repertoire. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Minerva, Venus, Apollo, Diana, Saturn, Bacchus, Ceres, each deity had visual attributes that appeared regularly in sculpture and painting. This visual familiarity created a common language, intelligible even to the illiterate. A lightning bolt in hand, Jupiter, lord of the skies and destiny, a spear and helmet, Mars, patron of war, a peacock in the background, Juno, queen of the gods and symbol of imperial dignity. The temples, placed in forums or at strategic sites, were true stages for the divine presence, and their decoration was carefully designed to align worship with politics. More than honoring the gods, religious art politicized them. A powerful example is the Ara Pacis Augustae, the altar of Augustan peace, erected in the year 9 before Christ. With reliefs that blend mythological figures and portraits of the imperial family, the monument not only thanks the gods for the peace achieved under Augustus's rule, but also inscribes the emperor himself into the sacred narrative. He is presented as Pontifex Maximus, as father of the nation, as restorer of cosmic order. The altar becomes, thus, a visual gospel of the new Roman era, the Pax Augusta, not as politics, but as divine revelation. The statues of the gods, scattered everywhere, were not merely objects of worship. they were also strategic pieces. In the Party Temple of Mars altar, commissioned by Augustus, the figure of the god was not simply a mythological entity, it was the embodiment of legitimate vengeance for the assassination of Julius Caesar. In this context, art did not narrate ancient myths, but updated recent history with a sacred veneer. Each cult reinforced a political choice. Each sculpture was an official interpretation of reality. With the empire's expansion and contact with other peoples, Rome incorporated foreign gods. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Asia Minor, and adapted them to its aesthetics and narrative. The temples of these deities, though more exotic, were integrated into Roman urban planning, and their images adopted the recognizable forms of classical sculpture. This religious absorption was also a strategy of control. By allowing the cult, Rome showed tolerance. By Romanizing the image, it showed supremacy. Even the gods had to dress in Roman fashion. The emperors themselves, especially after Augustus, began to be represented with divine features. Statues of Augustus as Apollo, of Vespasian as Jupiter, of Hadrian as Mars. In life or after death, they ascended to the pantheon, and art portrayed them as beings between men and gods. Coins, reliefs, and votive monuments multiplied this sacred image of the ruler, solidifying his spiritual as much as political authority. Mural painting also participated in this aesthetic of the sacred. In Pompeii and other cities, frescoes with mythological scenes adorned not only temples, but also private homes. Seeing a painting of the birth of Venus or the Judgment of Paris was as common as seeing family portraits. Mythology was part of the daily landscape, and its artistic representation reinforced collective identity. It was a visually shared religion, a theology of images that connected houses to palaces, temples to streets, people to emperor. Even with the rise of Christianity, religious art retained its function as propaganda. The first Christian basilicas were decorated with mosaics that exalted Christ as a cosmic sovereign, surrounded by imperial symbols, seated on thrones reminiscent of the Caesars. Christian iconography inherited the pomp and aesthetic of pagan art. Thus, the propaganda of the gods was adapted to a new god, but with the same intention: to rule hearts and minds through imagery. In Rome, the sacred was never purely spiritual. It was a visual construction, a symbolic engineering that used beauty to persuade, indoctrinate, and perpetuate. Roman religious art was, at once, devotion and doctrine of state, and in the stones of temples, in the figures of gods, in the shadows of frescoes, the message Rome so often repeated still echoes: he who controls the gods controls the world. In imperial Rome, the emperor was not merely a general, legislator, and pontiff. He was also, and perhaps above all, an architect of visual narratives. No other ruler of antiquity understood the power of imagery as deeply as the Caesars did. Their decisions extended far beyond politics and war. They acted as curators of their own eternity. Under their command, temples, palaces, forums, arches, theaters, columns, fountains, and gardens were erected. Under their supervision, artists and architects designed the symbols of Roman order, and in every construction, in every detail, there was more than just beauty. There was a message. The emperor was both the patron of art and the subject of art, the supreme sponsor and also the model it glorified. It all began with Augustus, the first to understand that an empire needed its own style. "I found Rome made of bricks and left it of marble," he declared, not as a metaphor but as a concrete policy. His reign marked an explosion of public works, funded under the banner of moral and spiritual renewal for the city, and more than just building, he'd commissioned art that exalted his deeds, such as the Arapacis, or that linked his lineage to gods like Apollo and Mars. The emperor shaped his image as a restorer of order and bearer of peace, and art made this visible, undeniable, and memorable. If Augustus set the paradigm, the emperors who followed expanded its scale. Nero, controversial and ambitious, built the Domus Aureus, the Golden House, with rotating halls, ceilings encrusted with gemstones, and frescoes that turned the chambers into a private cosmos. There, the emperor was not merely a patron, he was the aesthetic center of the universe. Many saw this as excess, blasphemy, megalomania, but from an artistic point of view, the Domus Aurea inaugurates a new phase of Roman art. luxury as political language, the environment as an extension of the ruler's persona. Over the following centuries, imperial patronage became a duty of power. Trajan financed massive projects. The Forum of Trajan, with its monumental column, and the Basilica Ulpia, became an urban manifesto of civilization and conquest. Hadrian, the philosopher and traveling emperor, used his refined taste to leave a lasting aesthetic mark. The Pantheon, rebuilt under his orders, is one of the most perfect fusions of engineering, spirituality, and cosmology. His villa in Tivoli was a laboratory of Roman art, with influences from Egypt, Greece, and Asia Minor, all reinterpreted through the lens of imperial sophistication. These works were not mere gifts to the people, they were tools of propaganda and diplomacy. The emperor who built showed not only power but also generosity. By creating public baths, theaters, fountains, and squares, he presented himself as father of the nation, a patron of beauty and order. But every gift came with a signature. Inscriptions on facades, prominent statues, and commemorative coins reminded all that everything existed because of him, and for him. The city became an imperial gallery under the open sky. Painting, sculpture, and literature also flourished under this patronage. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid were sponsored by Augustus's allies, such as Maecenas, whose name would become synonymous with arts patronage. Culture bloomed under the throne's support, but with a clear mission: to construct the myth of the empire. Books narrated heroes who foreshadowed Rome. Sculptures exalted the genealogy of the emperors. Paintings celebrated the city's manifest destiny. Even in times of crisis, emperors continued to finance art to reaffirm their legitimacy. Diocletian built a palace so grand in Dalmatia that centuries later it became the foundation of the city of Split. Constantine, in founding Constantinople, transferred the imperial aesthetic to the east, blending Roman columns with Christian churches and inaugurating a new phase of political art. Imperial art was never neutral. Every structure built, every image painted, every myth told was a piece on the symbolic chessboard of authority. And on this board, the emperor played with aesthetic talent and political calculation. He did not need to be physically present in every corner of the empire. It was enough for his image to be. It was enough for his monuments to speak for him. It was enough for marble to whisper in silence what time should never erase. I built, I ruled, I endured. Rome did not conquer territories solely with legions. It ruled them with straight lines, with well-planned streets, symmetrical forums, regular blocks, and temples aligned with the axis of the sun. The Roman city was a body built with mathematical proportions and a spirit organized by the geometry of power. From the simplest colonies to the most majestic provincial capitals, Roman urbanism followed an aesthetic principle that went far beyond beauty. It imposed order, and that order was visual, symbolic, and functional. It was ultimately a reflection of the very soul of the empire, a civilization that believed stability came from repetition, symmetry, and predictability, a civilization that architected its own authority. The basic structure of the Roman city was the Cardos and Decumanus, two great roads that intersected at right angles, dividing the city into 4 quadrants. This orthogonal pattern was not just practical, it was almost ritualistic. Rigorously repeated in dozens of cities founded from the 1st century before Christ onward, it revealed a worldview centered on reason, clarity, and the mastery of space. Each city was a miniature reflection of the capital. When walking down a street in Londinium, Lugdunum, or Timgad, a citizen knew they were in Rome, not because they saw the Colosseum, but because they recognized the spatial logic radiating from the urbs. Symmetry was a civic value. Roman urbanism was not organic like the Greek or Eastern cities. It was high designed, calculated, imposed. The blocks, called insulae, followed defined patterns, with designated spaces for housing, commerce, storage, worship, and circulation. The central squares, like the forums, functioned as centers of power and sociability, and the public buildings, baths, theaters, temples, markets, were arranged in ways that organized not only space, but also behavior. The city educated the gaze, and the gaze learned to see the world through the Roman rule. This aesthetic of control was visible in every urban element: The aqueducts, for example, drew perfect lines on the horizon, carrying water with both engineering and elegance. The roads like the Via Appia or the Via Egnatia, cut through valleys and hills with astonishing linearity. The monumental walls, with towers at regular intervals, embraced cities like geometric arms of protection. Monumentality did not arise by chance or accumulation. It was designed, planned, inscribed as the mark of a people who did not tolerate chaos. The houses, even in popular areas, followed a constructive logic. The elite domicile followed a symmetrical internal distribution. Atrium, peristyle, triclinium, cubicular, arranged around courtyards and visual axes. This composition was not merely aesthetic, but also symbolic. It reflected moral order, family hierarchy, and the ritual of daily life. Even the baths obeyed this logic. The thermae, with their sequential spaces, apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium, imitated the process of purification, from heat to cold, from body to spirit. Roman urbanism also revealed its vocation for permanence. The choice of materials, stone, concrete, baked bricks, aimed at durability, but not just physical, ideological durability. Every Roman city was a cultural anchor. Even after the political collapse of the empire, many of these cities continued to live, their streets preserved, their layouts reused for centuries. Paris, London, Vienna, Cologne, Barcelona, Lisbon, all rest upon Roman geometric skeletons. The city as the body of civilization. This aesthetic of order also manifested in architectural proportions. The use of the Case-E golden ratio, the relationship between columns and architraves, the height of arches, the spacing of windows, everything obeyed a harmonic logic. Beauty was that which made sense, that which was stable, that which reflected the cosmos. Vitruvius, an architect and theorist of the 1st century before Christ, codified this vision in his work De Architectura, stating that all construction should possess 3 qualities: firmitas, solidity; utilitas, functionality; and venustas, beauty. This triad became the foundation of Roman architecture, and of all Western architecture thereafter. Rome ruled by the sword, but it sustained its rule through the line. The ruler and the compass were invisible weapons that organized territories, shaped behaviors, and inscribed the will of the empire into the soil. The city's aesthetic was a silent pedagogy. It taught discipline, hierarchy, rationality, and it made the simple act of walking down a street a lesson in what it meant to live under the rule of order. As the Roman Empire expanded to the 4 corners of the known world, from the plains of Hispania to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the mountains of Cappadocia, it carried with it more than legions, taxes, and laws. It carried an imperial aesthetic and a visual, urban, and symbolic model that infiltrated the soil of local cultures like a planted seed. Wherever Rome arrived, it did not merely build roads and fortresses, it also built forums, temples, theaters, baths, and statues with the same symmetry and monumentality as the capital. Art thus became a tool of Romanization, a visual language that unified diverse peoples under a common, albeit imposed, identity. And even in the most distant frontiers of the empire, Roman marble whispered the same messages: order, civilization, eternity. Rome's first impression in a conquered city was almost always architectural. At a Roman colony, Christ would be founded with an orthogonal layout, a central forum, a temple to the Capitoline Triad, and gradually public buildings would rise, replicating the models of the urbs. In cities like Emerita Augusta, modern Merida, Lugdunum, Lyon, Caesarea Mauritaniae, Churchill, Tarraco, Tarragona, or Jerash in Syria, one can observe this aesthetic duplication. The Forum with its basilica, the triumphal arch celebrating Roman peace, the baths for ritual cleansing and social integration. Every column erected in the provinces was an aesthetic and political gesture. You are under Rome. See it, feel it, admire it. But artistic Romanization was not just imposition. There was dialogue by adaptation, syncretism. In many regions, local artisans began producing works in the Roman style, but with native touches. In Egypt, for instance, Funerary portraits were painted using Roman techniques, shadowing, perspective, naturalism, while maintaining traditional religious symbols. In Syria and Palestine, mosaics followed Roman spatial conventions and style, yet incorporated Eastern elements, such as Zoroastrian symbols and floral motifs unique to the region. In the mosaics of Antioch, one sees Dionysus flanked by Semitic-looking figures, representing a Rome that absorbed and reinterpreted the other. Sculpture also reflected this process. In the provinces, governors, magistrates, and local elites commissioned marble statues in the Roman portrait style, toga, hieratic posture, realistic facial features, as a way to affirm their Roman identity and loyalty to the emperor. Art became a symbol of status, a cultural passport. To be represented as Roman was, literally, to be recognized as civilized. Even local gods were Romanized. In Celtic regions, for example, deities like Tutatis and Epona were portrayed with Roman attributes or fused with figures like Mars and Diana. Art became the laboratory of cultural domination, but Roman aesthetics did not always erase local traits. In many cities, especially in North Africa and the East, hybrid forms have emerged, where Roman architectural foundations were decorated with elements of local tradition. Friezes with inscriptions in native languages, capitals with floral designs that deviated from classical orders, and even sculptures featuring non-Latin facial features and clothing, all contributed to a new imperial aesthetic language. Plural, flexible, adaptable. Rome, in extending its arms, did not close them entirely. By allowing small margins of expression, it strengthened the bond between center and periphery. Provincial art also served political communication. Many monuments built far from Italy were dedicated directly to the emperors. Inscriptions in Greek, Latin, or local languages exalted Caesar, thanked him for the construction of an aqueduct, or celebrated the visit of an imperial legate. Emperors used these monuments as instruments of aesthetic diplomacy. Governors used them to show loyalty and reinforce their position. Even the coins minted in the provinces followed official iconography. The emperor's face, Roman symbols, scenes of military victories, disseminating the image of power throughout the empire. When imperial administration began to decline, especially between the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, art in the provinces began to reflect that instability. Symmetrical perfection gave way to rougher forms. Naturalism lost ground to schematism. Yet even in crisis, the essential elements of Roman aesthetics endured. The arch, the dome, the portrait, the forum. And even after the fall of the empire, many of these elements were reused by barbarian, Byzantine, Arab, and medieval peoples. Roman art did not die. It dissolved into the very borders it had once drawn. On the fringes of the empire, Rome built more than cities. It built mirrors. Mirrors in which the conquered peoples could see themselves as part of something greater, more ancient, more glorious. Art was the invisible cement of Roman unity. And even in the deserts of the East, the forests of Germania, the fields of Gaul, or the shores of Britannia, Rome whispered its aesthetic message. You are now part of eternity. If Rome was a civilization obsessed with images, with faces, bodies, portraits, and monuments, it was also, paradoxically, a society that sculpted female silence. Women, though present in streets, rituals, homes, and palaces, were rarely at the center of public art. Their bodies were more controlled than celebrated, their presence more suggested than declared. And when they did appear, in statues, busts, or frescoes, it was almost always through filters of morality, myth, and male power. The empire that immortalized emperors, gods, generals, and even slaves in marble was reluctant to grant women a full place in the gallery of eternity. And for that reason, what Roman art reveals about women speaks as much as what it hides. In public sculpture, for example, the female figure did appear, but almost always under ideological masks. Women were portrayed as goddesses, Venus, Juno, Minerva, Diana, never as ordinary individuals. When not deified, they appeared as allegories: peace, victory, abundance, liberty. Their bodies followed classical Greek models, gently idealized, with serene expressions and composed postures. They were beautiful but not dangerous, sensual but not provocative, present but not authors of their own narrative. They were symbols, not subjects. Within imperial families, however, women gained aesthetic visibility, though always as mere extensions of male power. Empresses and elite Roman matrons were portrayed with modest garments, veils covering their hair, and idealized features evoking domestic virtues: fidelity, modesty, motherhood. Livia, wife of Augustus, was portrayed as a model of sobriety and morality. Agrippina, mother of Nero, appeared on coins and reliefs as the mother of the rightful heir. But none of these images celebrated autonomy. They were visual instruments to reinforce dynastic stability, bloodline continuity, and the nobility of lineage. The female bust became a pedestal for imperial masculinity. In patrician homes, women appeared more frequently and with more ambiguity. Frescoes in Pompeii depict female figures in prominent positions, women reading, playing instruments, presiding over banquets, or embodying muses and mythical heroines. But the context is revealing. These images adorned private spaces, destined for the male gaze. Domestic art offered a more intimate view, yet still filtered by desire, idealization, and control. Woman was muse, object of contemplation, symbol of culture and refinement, but rarely the author of her own visual story. Curiously, the funerary portrait may be the space where Roman women came closest to a real presence. In columbaria and family tombs, we find busts of women with individualized features, inscriptions praising their virtue, their dedication to the home, their memory. Some are shown with books, instruments, jewelry, signs of education and status. Here, the marble seems less propagandistic and more affectionate. Funerary art reveals what public art concealed: the woman as subject, as lived being, as a figure who left behind longing and legacy. And even in these images, the echo of norms remains. They are good wives, exemplary mothers, devoted daughters. The frame remains moral, even when the portrait is personal. Another space where women appear with stronger symbolic force is the realm of mythology. Scenes of Helen, Andromeda, Penelope, Clytemnestra, Lucretia, and Medea were painted on the walls of homes as moral dramas, tragic archetypes, veiled warnings. The mythical woman was exalted for her beauty, or condemned for her cunning. She almost never escaped the judging gaze. Even when strong, like Amazons or fleeing nymphs, it was always in contrast to male control. The female body was desired, but also feared. Art expressed this tension, this ambivalence between veneration and domination, and yet the image of the woman in Rome never vanished. She persisted in the corridors of homes, on provincial coins, in votive panels, in cameo jewelry, in theatrical masks. Art sculpted her with modesty, with distance, with control, but also with admiration. For even when made invisible, women were the guardians of tradition, the matrons of morality. There were bridges between home and temple, between birth and tomb. They were portrayed less than they deserved, and yet still shaped the world that was seen. And today, when we encounter a Roman bust of an anonymous woman, with stone eyes staring into the void, hair meticulously carved and lips sealed, perhaps what impacts us most is not what she reveals, but what she withholds. The visual silence of Roman women is an invitation to listen, and to listen to that silence is perhaps the first step toward restoring their full presence in the marble of history. Death, for the Romans, was not a silent end hidden in the shadows of mourning. It was a public ritual, a carefully choreographed transition between the world of the living and that of memory. And this transition had to be visible, tangible, monumental. In Rome, even dying was a political, social, and aesthetic act. Burial was not merely eternal rest. It was an opportunity to declare status, virtue, genealogy, loyalty to the gods and the empire. That is why tombs, columbaria, and especially sarcophagi became not just funerary boxes, but true works of art, conceived to endure, to move, and to teach. A final message in stone, eternal, sculpted to be read with the eyes and felt through time. Along the Via Appia, one of Rome's oldest and most famous roads, mausoleums, stelae, and funerary towers stand as testimony to the importance of visible death. Roman law forbade burials within the city, but encouraged tombs to be built along roads leading into it. Thus, everyone entering or leaving Rome was forced to pass by the monuments of those who had already departed. It was an open-air funerary gallery, where posterity was claimed through marble and inscriptions. "I was what you are, you will be what I am," read some epitaphs, reminding the living that glory and vanity too ended beneath the ground. Among the most famous examples of funerary architecture stands the Mausoleum of Augustus, a vast circular structure inspired by Hellenistic tombs, where the first emperor and his descendants were laid to rest, a monument to power, dynasty, and imperial eternity. Centuries later, the Mausoleum of Hadrian, which would become the Castel Sant'Angelo, took this tradition even further, a tomb turned fortress, turned bastion of memory. The death of emperors, like their lives, also had to be monumental, but it was in sarcophagi that Roman funerary art reached its most intimate and sophisticated expression. Carved with rich detail, they told stories, sometimes mythical, sometimes everyday, sometimes deeply personal. In many cases, the deceased was depicted reclining on the lid, as if attending an eternal banquet. On the sides, scenes of heroes like Hercules, Ulysses, or Aeneas illustrated virtues such as courage, wisdom, and loyalty. At other times, pastoral scenes appeared, with shepherds, nymphs, gardens, and animals, an idyllic landscape offering consolation to the living and metaphorical rest to the dead. The iconography of sarcophagi evolved over time. At the height of the empire, mythological representations prevailed, perhaps because myths offered narratives of transcendence and glory. In late antiquity, with the rise of Christianity, the images changed. Biblical episodes began to appear: Daniel in the lion's den, Jonah and the whale, the Good Shepherd, all with powerful symbolic meaning of salvation, rebirth, and hope. Funerary art adapted to the new religious spirit without abandoning the Roman aesthetic legacy. The faces, reliefs, and geometric patterns continued to echo centuries of tradition. Even the most humble sought representation. In the catacombs, King's underground burial networks used especially by Christian and Jewish communities, we find wall paintings, graffiti with prayers, and discrete symbols of faith and resistance. There the art was simpler, but no less eloquent. The act of painting a dove, carving a fish, or outlining an amphora was for these anonymous Romans a way of affirming that death did not erase identity. Equally important were the funerary epitaphs. Inscriptions in Latin with fixed formulas, abbreviations, and short poems were carefully carved into tombs. Many praised the deceased's virtues: castissima et pudicissima conium, most chaste and modest wife; amicus fidelis, faithful friend, while others left philosophical warnings or emotional remembrances. The word engraved in stone was an attempt to hold back forgetting, to extend life through memory. In funerary art, Rome exposed its soul. There lay pride, grief, vanity, hope, and fear. Each tomb was a mirror of its time, and each sarcophagus a narrative suspended between what was and what one hoped to be. Even today, walking through museums or necropolises, touching the cold stone of a Roman tomb, one feels a presence, because Rome understood, perhaps better than any other civilization, that death does not silence those who know how to sculpt themselves into time. As the Roman Empire approached its final centuries, its cities still gleamed with marble, columns still supported temples, sculptures still adorned plazas, but something had changed. Art, once vibrant, innovative, deeply symbolic, began to repeat formulas, to lose technical precision, to obscure its own purpose. As if in trying to keep alive the memory of a fading greatness, Rome was no longer sculpting power, but the nostalgia of power. This was the time when aesthetics became empty ritual, splendor turned into simulacrum, and the empire, still monumental in appearance, began to crumble from within. Art in times of crisis became an echo, a reflection without light of a flame already extinguished. From the 3rd century after Christ onward, the empire faced multiple pressures: barbarian invasions at the borders, rampant inflation, administrative collapse, political instability. Emperors succeeded one another rapidly, many assassinated or deposed, and art, as the mirror of this chaos, could no longer hide the cracks in civilization. The expressive realism of imperial portraits gave way to rigid, schematic faces with fixed, disproportionate eyes. Emotional expression gave way to stiffness. The body, once studied with anatomy and motion, became flat, frozen. Sculpture was no longer celebration. It was insistence. a desperate attempt to say, "We are still Rome," when everything around was shouting the opposite. Monuments continued to be erected, but they now bore marks of urgency and exhaustion. The Arch of Constantine, for example, built in the early 4th century after Christ, incorporated reliefs and sculptures taken from earlier monuments, from golden ages like the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. This visual collage, known as chaospolia, was not done merely for economy of materials, but also as a symbolic act of appropriating past glory. It was as if the new emperor were saying, "I am the rightful heir of the past." But this heir no longer created, he copied. Art became a repetition, reminiscence, melancholic reverence. On coins, imperial figures became caricatures of power. Hair styled like helmets, eyes increasingly large, inscriptions that praised titles more than real deeds. Cities still adorned forums and baths with mosaics, but with increasingly geometric and stylized patterns. Naturalistic precision was replaced by a more symbolic aesthetic, less concerned with the body, more focused on the spirit. It was the foreshadowing of the transition from classical art to early Christian and Byzantine art, where the image's value lay in its spiritual message, not its likeness. This process, however, was not merely a technical decline, it was also a shift in worldview. The very idea of beauty was transforming. The empire, once proud of symmetry and proportion as reflections of cosmic order, now saw art as a bridge to the invisible divine. Early Christians, persecuted for centuries, were gaining space in the cities, and their art emerged in the underground, in catacombs, discrete inscriptions, enigmatic symbols. When Christianity was officially recognized at the end of the 4th century, emperors no longer wished to resemble Jupiter or Mars, but humble shepherds or celestial judges. Roman aesthetics ceased to represent the glorious body and began to narrate the immortal soul. At the same time, the provinces fragmented, and provincial art took on rustic forms, mixing local traditions with central aesthetics. In many cases, stone sarcophagi no longer bore defined faces. Statues lost classical proportions. Art, like the empire itself, slowly became disfigured, and what remained was monumentality as a shell, as a symbol of something that no longer stood. The eternal city still existed, but was covered in shadows, in silence, in abandonment. And yet, even in this context of collapse, Roman art endured, not as before, but as legacy. The past still spoke, in the ruins that travelers touched, in the columns that defied centuries, in the words that echoed from tombs. The art of crisis taught not only of endings, but also of persistence. Political collapse did not destroy Rome's aesthetic heritage, it merely transformed it. And that transformation is what allowed the Roman spirit to pass through the Middle Ages, to be reborn in the Renaissance, and to continue inspiring to this day. Art in times of crisis was, paradoxically, the art of survival. When all else fell, it remained. Even harsher, less refined, less grand, it still declared, "Rome is still here." And perhaps this is its deepest message. When empires fall, images endure. When Christianity emerged among the alleys, catacombs, and whispered voices of the persecuted, it seemed like a foreign body within the monumental aesthetic of Rome. It was a faith of the humble, the slaves, the forgotten, a belief that refused to kneel before marble gods and rejected the temples that upheld the empire's aura. And yet, in just a few centuries, that silent faith not only survived, it became the new backbone of the Roman world. And with it, a new visual language arose, slowly shaped by the tension between tradition and revelation, between the dying body and the ascending soul. Thus was born a new sacred aesthetic, not created to exalt emperors, but to guide believers toward eternity. In its beginnings, Christian art hid, in symbols, in metaphors, in disguised images. In the catacombs of Rome, like those of St. Calixtus, Domitilla, and Priscilla, we find the first traces of this emerging art. Fish drawn on walls, anchors discreetly carved, shepherds carrying sheep on their shoulders, images that communicated hope, salvation, and belonging, without drawing the wrath of censors. These primitive icons did not seek Roman grandeur. They did not aim to persuade through form, but to console through faith. Beauty was no longer symmetry. It was what pointed to the invisible. With the official recognition of Christianity under Constantine, Christian art rose to the surface and found the tools of pagan Rome at its disposal. Temples became basilicas. Adapted from Roman civil buildings, there was no longer a need for a frontal stage for the cult of a statue. Now, the space was oriented toward the community, the altar, the word. The Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Basilica of St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Sabina, all preserved Roman structure while inverting their symbolic function. Instead of monuments to empire, they became monuments to divine eternity. On the walls and ceilings of these new churches, mosaics replaced frescoes. With golden and colored glass stones, they created atmospheres of celestial light. Christ was no longer portrayed as the suffering man, but as the Pantocrator, the Lord of the universe, seated on a throne surrounded by angels, evangelists, and saints. His face became more abstract, more fixed, more symbolic. The eyes, large and penetrating, gazed directly at the faithful, not as a portrait, but as a spiritual presence. Beauty was no longer naturalistic, it was mystical. This new aesthetic also transformed the way the body was represented. The heroic nude, so celebrated in classical sculpture, gave way to long robes, schematic forms, hieratic postures. Martyrs were shown serene, even in suffering. Flesh was no longer an object of admiration, but a passageway. Art no longer sought to seduce the gaze, but to elevate the soul. And to do this, it used the language of allegory, celestial symmetry, and liturgical repetition. Christian art absorbed Rome's structure, but filled it with new meanings, new hopes, new truths. The first representations of Nabo, Mary, the apostles, and the saints also emerged during this period. Mary, with a deep blue mantle and calm expression, became the new maternal figure of Roman art, replacing the matronly Juno. Peter and Paul were depicted with fixed features, already canonized in the imagination. Gospel scenes, the baptism of Christ, the Last Supper, the resurrection of Lazarus, began to form the new visual vocabulary. Each image was also catechesis. In a society where many could not read, art began to teach faith through color and form. With the division of the empire and the rise of Constantinople, this new aesthetic would develop into what we now call Byzantine art. But in its essence, it still carried Rome. In domes, in arches, in marble pavements, the imperial past remained, now in service of a single god. Art became visible theology. A new temple had been born, not of Ionic columns, but of golden mosaics, not of multiple gods, but of one Christ, king and judge, ruler of an empire without borders and without end. Christianity did not destroy Roman art, it transfigured it. Where once there was power, now there was transcendence. Where there had been military triumph, now there was martyrdom. Where there had been portraits of earthly glory, now there were icons of eternal salvation. And in this transition, Rome did not lose its aesthetic soul. It merely entrusted it to the invisible. When Rome's marbles began to be covered in moss, when columns were toppled by the centuries, and forgotten temples became quarries for new medieval buildings, it seemed that Roman splendor had been swallowed by time. But Rome never vanished. It slept beneath the ruins, waiting to be rediscovered. And that moment came with overwhelming force during the Renaissance, when artists, architects, thinkers, and poets turned their eyes to what remained of antiquity with a mix of reverence and hunger. It was as if the bones of the eternal city began to pulse again beneath the dust of time. Roman art, dormant, was awakened, and with it, the world was reborn. For centuries, the remnants of Rome lay scattered, silent. Many sculptures had been buried, others dismantled, others Christianized or reused. But in the 15th century, in Florence, Rome, and Venice, humanist intellectuals began seeking the texts of classical authors such as Vitruvius, Cicero, and Pliny. And at the same time, they excavated the physical remains of ancient Rome. Finding a broken column or a marble torso was like discovering a lost truth. And these fragments began to inspire a new artistic language, deeply rooted in the aesthetics of proportion, harmony, reason, and ideal beauty. The great names of the Renaissance, Brunelleschi, Alberti, Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael, immersed themselves in Roman forms with fervor. Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon to build his dome in Florence. Alberti wrote architectural treatises based on Vitruvian principles. Michelangelo absorbed the expressive musculature of ancient marbles to sculpt his David. Raphael decorated the Vatican's stanzas with scenes in which Roman philosophers returned to life. And in each artistic gesture, Rome was brought back, not as a dead copy, but as an ancestral flame reignited. In architecture, the legacy was even more visible. The classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, once again dominated facades. Golden proportions began to guide palaces and churches. The dome, the barrel vault, the arch, Roman inventions, became pillars of the new European architecture. And not only in Italy, this aesthetic traveled to France, England, Germany, Spain. Centuries later, it would cross the Atlantic and give shape to entire capitals inspired by Rome, such as Washington, D.C., with its Capitol, its obelisks, its civic temples. The imperial city had become a universal model of power and civilization. The neoclassicism of the 18th century deepened this bond even further. The excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum reignited fascination with Roman daily life. Painters such as Jacques-Louis David depicted heroic scenes with the stoic morality of the ancients. Sculptors like Canova revived the purity of classical forms. Palaces, theaters, gardens, and academies across Europe began to replicate Rome's visual grammar. It was no longer merely art, it was a declaration of cultural identity. To be modern was to be Rome's heir, and even through revolutions, political, aesthetic, technological, Rome remained present. Napoleon had himself portrayed as a new Caesar. The fascist regimes of the 20th century exploited imperial iconography to legitimize their power. But Roman art resisted such ideological appropriations with a force of its own. Its true influence does not lie in the copies, but in what it taught. That space can educate, that form can govern, that beauty can be order, and that art can be memory shaped in stone. In museums around the world, from the Louvre to the British Museum, from the Uffizi to the Metis, Roman statues still stand contemplated by millions, no longer as mere fragments of a distant past, but as mirrors of something essentially human. The search for meaning, for permanence, for expression. In every bust, in every sarcophagus, in every capital, we feel that Rome never ended. It lives in the hand of an architect, in the stroke of a painter, in the silence of a marble that never stopped speaking. Roman art was, and still is, a bridge between worlds, between matter and spirit, between power and beauty, between the past and what is yet to come. Its legacy does not dwell only in ruins. It lives in the way we see the world, build cities, represent our ideals, and dream of the eternal. They are still there, standing, broken, silent, but not mute. The ruins of Rome are not rubble. They are words in stone, unfinished sentences of a language that still pulses through the veins of civilization. Whoever walks among the fallen columns of the Forum, the worn corridors of the Colosseum, the quiet arches of the Via Sacra, is not merely facing the past. They are facing a mirror of human time. A mirror that reflects ambition, beauty, power, art, but also fragility, collapse and forgetting. Rome is not a buried city. It is a memory exposed to the sun, the rain, the wind, and to the eyes that dare to listen. Roman art and architecture did not vanish with the emperors. They transcended bodies, wars, and regimes, because they were not made solely to worship gods or glorify men, but to resist time. And in resisting, they were transformed. From political propaganda, they became universal heritage. From pagan cult, spiritual inspiration. From imperial construction, the foundation of cities, academies, museums, and dreams. When we look at a Roman statue, we do not see merely the face of a senator or an emperor. We see the concentrated expression of an entire era. We see the desperate and grand attempt of a people to engrave their passage with such force that not even the centuries, nor ashes, nor barbarians, nor time itself would be able to erase it. And somehow, they succeeded, because even in pieces, Roman images still communicate. And what they say is not only history, it is destiny. Rome understood, before all others, that modernity begins with form, That marble, when touched with intention, can survive the collapse of ideas. That a city may die, but its arches can stand like the bones of the world. That man is brief, but what he builds with soul and proportion can cross millennia. Rome taught this, and its art is the living proof. Today, in a world that changes with feverish speed, where images multiply across screens and vanish in seconds, the aesthetic legacy of Rome calls us to slowness, to detail, to contemplation, to the weight of the symbol. In times of noise, its ruins whisper, and in that whisper we rediscover an essential question: what will we leave behind after we pass? Roman art does not offer easy answers, but it offers us the model of permanence. The reminder that if we wish to be heard in the future, we must carve the present with purpose. We must design space with intelligence, build with harmony, create with meaning. We must, as the Romans did, speak to the world through stone, through bronze, through line. Because in the end, Rome is not only what it was, it is everything it still inspires. Its ruins are not epitaphs, they are continuous beginnings. They are witnesses that, when art carries truth, it never stops speaking.